Hi, I'm Tamara, and this is TELUS Talks with Tamara Taggart. Hi, everyone. Today I'm speaking with clinical psychologist Dr. Miriam Kirrmaier. Today we talk about friendships, how to respond to conflicts and difficulties, and how we should manage friendship challenges to build stronger, closer connections. I hope you enjoy the conversation. Hi, Miriam. It's great to see you.
Hi, so glad to be here.
So I'm always fascinated by conversations about friendships, especially, as we leave high school and elementary school and get into adult life, and it changes a lot. And now that I'm in my 50s, boy, oh boy, do friendships ever change a lot. Why did, as a clinical psychologist, why did you find friendships so interesting?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And in some ways, it's hard for me to answer. And yet, in looking back, kind of the road to focus on friendship has been clear all along in some ways. So I have always been really interested in the link between our relationships and our mental health, and seeing very clearly that that relationship is very much bi-directional and transactional even. And what I mean by that is when we are struggling in our relationships, understandably that can impact our mental health and well-being. But we also see when we are feeling overwhelmed, which so many of us are, right? Especially now, when we are feeling anxious, when we're feeling down or even depressed, that can have a tremendous impact on our relationships as well. And so that really interested me. And I thought that there was a really important opportunity to delve a little bit deeper into that connection. And a lot of the work, both in terms of research and also systems of support, is there for our romantic relationships, for our family relationships. And what I mean by that is when we think about, for example, even just therapy, right? We seek therapy as individuals, as couples, as families, but rarely as friends. And what I was noticing in my training early on was that there was a lot of support and emphasis on helping children and youth to make friends. We kind of collectively understand that this is important, and children should learn how to socialize and develop that spirit of collaboration and cooperation. And then for one reason or another, as we, as you said, grow out of or age out of elementary school, of high school, even university and college, there isn't really that same explicit emphasis on helping people to foster those connections. And again, people don't seek therapy for their friendship challenges. And a lot of the research, even when I first started doing this work from an empirical standpoint, just wasn't really looking at how to help people make and keep friends and navigate all the challenges that come up. And so it was this really interesting opportunity, because at the same time, what we were seeing very clearly was that our friendships are one of the most important predictors of how healthy we are and how long we live. And so we know that they're important, and yet there was this whole area, unexplored area really, about the how. Well, how do we, again, meet people? How do we deepen our connections? How do we end friendships that are no longer aligned with who we are and where we're going in life? And so those questions just, I think, were really interesting to me, and also deeply personal as well, because all of us can relate to the experience of losing touch with a friend, or meeting somebody new and wanting to develop that closeness, or suddenly being in a position in our life where we have to make new friends because we've left our existing network behind. And yeah, it's just been a really interesting journey all along. And
it is fascinating. So it's interesting. While you were talking, I was thinking, gosh, when we're in school, like elementary school, high school, we're sort of forced into friendships in a way, right? Because we're with these kids. Some of us change schools a lot. Some people stay at the same schools. So you're, I guess, I don't want to say forced, but you're kind of forced to be friends with these people that you're going to school with. Then you go to university, if you go that way, or you go out into the working world, and now you've got to make new friends. Does something happen as adults where we view some friendships as disposable? I just find that sometimes we move through we lose connections. What is that?
Yeah, there's so many different ways that we can take this conversation, because I do think you're touching on something important, which is that there tends to be a lot more fluidity in our friendships when we, again, grow and as we age. That when we're younger, very often it is that shared classroom environment that is keeping us together, encouraging us, forcing us maybe even to connect, right? That doesn't necessarily mean that we're friends with everyone, but we do have the opportunity to be friends with people. And we know that frequency and consistency are two of the most important predictors of whether a friendship is going to develop and be sustainable in some way. And the older we get, the fewer opportunities we have to be tied together in that way. We just don't have the same amount of time to spend socializing with our peers. And it can be harder to know who we connect with and even how to strike up a conversation. And I think one of the other big barriers that I've certainly encountered in my work, there's this expectation that we have and that we place on ourselves that we should know what to say and do, and that everyone else has it figured out. And the difficulty, of course, is not only is that untrue, but it contributes to a tremendous amount of shame and even isolation and loneliness, feeling like I'm alone in finding adult friendships confusing and complicated and difficult to navigate. And that is definitely a theme that comes up in my work with clients a lot. Coming to therapy, wanting to have connections and make deep, meaningful friendships, and feeling like, do other people struggle with this? I feel really alone. And that, of course, again, makes it all the more difficult given that transactional relationship between what's going on with our own mental health and well-being and what's happening outside in our relationships.
Oh boy, I have so many questions. Okay, so is how we're raised or how we see the people raising us, whether that be parents, grandparents, aunts and uncles, parents, friends, whoever, how they handle their friendships as adults. Are we watching that as kids? And then that's how,
this is a fantastic question. And I think something that we don't talk enough about, frankly, because again, there is this, on some level, collective awareness that we should be modeling healthy relationships for our children, that's something that a lot of us parents aspire to do, right? There's a lot of talk about how important that is. But we don't often talk about how we're modeling healthy friendships. And you're very right. You're touching on something that's very true, which is that children are watching. And as children, we internalize certain messages. And that can look like, how are my parents choosing to spend their time? And are they prioritizing their friendships? And what am I learning as a result in terms of where friendships should fall in my list of priorities, or how much of an effort I should make to go out and make and keep healthy friendships, right? But we're also learning implicitly other things like how comfortable am I with vulnerability and opening up? How able am I to ask for support and express what it is I need? How giving am I with my time? Do I struggle to show up for people in times of need? Or on the other hand, am I overly giving? And is there on some level this belief that I need to always be in that giver or giving role in order to keep people close to me? And so all of these little messages certainly have an impact in terms of how we think about friendships, but also what our friendships are going to be like later on. I also think it's true for many people that our own early friendship experiences can set the foundation for our later connections in life. And so when we have had the experience of having very close and meaningful friendships, that can really boost our resilience later on. The opposite can also have consequences, obviously, for our well-being, where if we've experienced peer victimization or bullying, or if we just felt like a little bit of an outsider, or we couldn't really find our place, if we've moved a lot and have had, again, very fluid friendships, that can impact how safe we feel in friendships later on. And that's obviously where attachment theory comes in and our sense of psychological safety. And there's a lot to unpack there. But I do think that this idea of the importance of early friendship experiences impacting our later connections is so important to be talking about.
Yeah, I do too. And, I was thinking, my girls are 12 and 14 now. So in the thick of it, right? And I remember those ages very well. And friendships. But I also remember watching movies, right? And now I'm seeing my girls watch movies. And the way that, movies or TV shows show friendships is, as we know, because it's entertainment, not always real life. Does that sort of stuff, what kind of an impact does that have on, and I feel like it's mostly girls and women, but I could be wrong.
Yes. I mean, certainly media, and we can talk also about the role that social media plays in this, right? Because that's a whole other conversation, albeit related. That too can have an impact on how we think about friendships, how we see ourself as a friend. I often think about these two extremes that are often portrayed when it comes to women's friendships or female friendships. And that is either this Mean Girls phenomenon, right? I think of that being like a very formative movie in a lot of young women's lives, a lot of people's lives for that matter. But that is one experience, right? Centering the idea of relational aggression as being core in some way to the friendship experience and normalizing that. And not to say that that doesn't happen in real life. It absolutely does. And actually, Mean Girls was based on some research coming out of Nikki Crick's lab. And there was a fantastic book that was written called Queen Bees and Wannabes. And so there is a lot of research on this. But I do think sometimes the other side of the equation gets lost, which is what a healthy friendship looks like. And when I said there were two sides, so on one end, there's this Mean Girls phenomenon. And on the other, there's this very intense closeness, almost like a sister relationship, sisterhood, right? Which is beautiful to center in terms of storytelling. The caveat to this is the expectations that people have about, again, what their friendships should look like. And some of the messages that I often hear is this very deeply held belief that I should have a best friend or I need to have a best friend. If I don't have that friendship experience, that either there's something wrong with me, that I'm doing friendships incorrectly, or that I'm not going to be able to benefit from them in the way that I really want to. Or frankly, the idea that healthy friendships are immune to conflict, which is not true either. And rarely do we see these more nuanced portrayals of friendship that are teaching us how to navigate conflict in a way that actually brings us closer and is really reflective of the reality of friendships.
Yeah. And conflict is a reality. I mean, it happens all the time. I don't think there's anybody out there that hasn't had a conflict with a friend.
No.
But how do we learn to deal with conflict? Is that something that you just learn throughout life, having lots of different friends? Or is there a right or wrong way, or trial and error?
There's so much that goes into negotiating challenging situations and conflicts. And a big part of this, I do think, comes from practice, because these are skills, right? Learning to assert ourselves, learning to have healthy communication, being able to put into words, whether it's to share with somebody else or even for ourselves, what it is that just is rubbing us the wrong way. These are all skills that we can learn with time, with experience. And so I think about that end of things as being aligned with kind of our competence, right? How able are we to manage and work through that conflict? The flip side of this, though, I often think of as confidence. And that is the idea that not only do I know what to do, I have confidence that I can do that. And I have confidence that my friendships can withstand that kind of transparency and vulnerability. And for some people, it really is that skills piece that's difficult because we haven't been taught, or that hasn't been modeled, or we're just really not sure what to say or do. And for others, it's really that piece of knowing that, again, we're allowed to voice our needs, that our relationships can tolerate that, and actually that's a means to closeness, greater closeness over time. And that too is learned through experience and testing out some of those fear-based beliefs, really.
Yeah, and a lot of times, it makes the friendship stronger, right? If you can work through a conflict. But conflict is so hard. Like, it's never, I find friendship conflict is, and like you said right off the beginning, right? We go to couples therapy, or we go to therapy for ourselves, but our friendships are these relationships. Some of them are lifelong relationships. Some of them are longer relationships than with your partner. And, they can be devastating if there is a conflict that is unresolved, or, you can carry some deep, deep pain with you if you don't know how to work through conflict, or.
Yeah. There's so many different obstacles that can show up when it comes to navigating that friendship conflict above and beyond the confidence and competence piece that we just spoke about. And I think, again, a lot of this ties in with the beliefs that we hold collectively about friendship, right? Not only that they shouldn't involve conflict or that there's something wrong with our friendship if we do experience some type of strain, but very often we dismiss our friendships as second tier or see conflict as something that's more juvenile, right? As opposed to honoring our experience and our feelings and recognizing, as you're saying, that this is inevitable. This will show up. And even if we're the type of person who's a little bit more conflict avoidant and we don't like to label things or highlight them in some type of assertive way, that doesn't mean the conflict isn't impacting us, right? We can still feel that sense of distance, of loneliness, of frustration, resentment, anger, anxiety, sadness. All of those feelings can really be there underneath the surface and cause consequences not only for our mental health, but for our friendships as well. And I think this is one piece that often gets lost, that link between our mental health, our well-being, how healthy we are, how long we live. That is very closely linked with our friendships, but it's linked with the quality of our friendships. And so in many ways, it's not enough to surround ourselves with people and collect those friendships, right? We really want to be focusing on how can we deepen our friendships and how can we make those connections more meaningful and more aligned with, again, who we are and what we value and what we want in our lives.
Yeah. And it's as soon as you said that, it made me think, when we're younger, it's about how many friends you have. It's not about the quality. It's about, I'm popular, or, oh, they're the popular kids and, they don't really talk to other people, or this and that. And we know as we grow up that it's not really, it's not about that anymore. It's about the quality. It's about the person you can call in the middle of the night because you are sad, or the person that will come and pick you up, when your car breaks down, or whatever it might be, right? How has... You mentioned social media, so let's go there for a minute.
That's obviously where my mind went to as soon as you brought that up. Yeah.
Right? So how does that... I feel more disconnected sometimes, or I feel, or maybe I feel like, oh, if I can see what my friends are doing on social media, then I don't need to phone them because I know what they're doing. I know they just, went and bought a new outfit or whatever it might be because it was on social media. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It changes our friendships, doesn't it?
It does. It can, I should say. It can change our friendships. It certainly changes the way that we tend to think about our relationships. And I think one of the dangers is that we are more likely to try and quantify things, right? How many followers do I have? How many likes do I have? That's not to say that everyone is preoccupied with this. And of course, there are generational differences as well, based on what our experience has been. But there is this subtle shift towards thinking about quantity over quality, I think at our great detriment. The flip side of that, though, is that people can be very quick to dismiss technology and social media as being at odds with healthy connections. And there is some research supporting that. But the big takeaway for me has been how are we using technology and social media to bring us closer, and how do we navigate some of the obstacles to that sense of closeness. And one of the big themes that comes up in my work with clients, again, is this idea of intentionality, right? How are you showing up when you pick up your phone to scroll through some of these apps? What's going on in your mind as you are more passively consuming content? Because one of the things that we see is that doing that mindless scrolling, or maybe it's not mindless, maybe what's actually happening is you're making assumptions as you're scrolling. Oh, I wasn't invited to that gathering. Oh, I see how many likes or friends they have. What does that mean about me and my worth, right? Those types of fleeting thoughts can really chip away at our sense of self-worth, our sense of self even, and contribute to greater distance and loneliness. But if we come to the table prepared to reach out to somebody or share something that feels really meaningful to us that we want other people to see and appreciate, that can actually bring us closer. And so I do see in my practice, in my own life, especially in the context of the pandemic when people are so distanced, thank goodness for some of these apps and platforms that allow us to meet new people, to expand our networks, to stay connected. But we really need to be thinking about how we're using them. I think that's one of the big takeaways.
Yeah, big time. And you mentioned the pandemic. So how has the pandemic changed it? Like, I mean, you must have seen it being, in your clinic, you must have seen the impact of the pandemic, the last 3 years at least, on friendships.
Yeah, absolutely. There are, again, two sides to this. Certainly, the last few years have been very challenging for all of us and for so many different reasons. And one of the themes that we have seen is that feelings of loneliness, for example, have increased over time, and that physical distance, but perhaps even more so the emotional distance that people have felt, that has been a big contributor to, again, that feeling of loneliness and disconnection, and also mental health struggles. Many people are losing touch with friends because they're not able to socialize in the same way, or because something about the friendship has changed. And I think for many people, it's also been a period of self-reflection, again, of recognizing how much we have to give realistically, and which relationships we are motivated to maintain and can realistically maintain. And so for many people, that has resulted in loss of certain friendships, or a shrinking in some ways of our time spent with friends and our connections. And that isn't necessarily a bad thing, again, if we're focusing on quality over quantity. But I do think that it's important that we think about how we're meeting our need for connection. And this is actually a new theme that I'm really hearing a lot about. We have all been in this forced state of avoidance, right? Having to turn down plans because we're sick, because we're unable to make it, because it doesn't align with our level of risk tolerance, all the different reasons, right? Now that, I hesitate to say this, but now that things are opening up, the world is opening up a little bit more, it can be very difficult to then step outside of that place of avoidance. And we know that avoidance actually increases our experience of anxiety. And so I think that's part of the reason why we're seeing that many people are feeling socially anxious to attend, whether it's one-on-one get-togethers with friends or larger gatherings. It just feels a little less comfortable. And many people are in that place where they're kind of renegotiating, how do I do that? And how do I step outside of my comfort zone? And I think it's really important to normalize this and to bring a little bit of compassion to the table, because again, I am hearing that narrative of, well, there's something wrong with me that I'm going through this, as opposed to recognizing there are very good reasons why this is showing up.
And also, it's showing up for a lot of people.
Yes.
Like you said, I think that people think that it's only them. It's not. It's a lot of people. Even in kids, I'm seeing it too, right? Because we've stayed home so much over the last 3 years. Okay, there's lots more to talk about. But before we do that, we always like to give back to for our guest being here. And so we ask our guests to choose a Canadian charity. And you chose the Jewish General Hospital Foundation, whose mission is to advance healthcare and medical research for the people of Quebec. We will be giving them $500 in your name. So thank you so much for choosing the Jewish General Hospital Foundation. I really appreciate that.
Thank you. That means a lot to me and to so many people.
Yeah, well, thank you. And thank you for your time, for being here. So, is it easier? You were just talking about, we were talking about conflict and we were talking about avoidance, and it made me think, and I can only speak from my own experience, but I assume I'm not alone, where, you mentioned we've been reevaluating things in the last 3 years. There are some friendships where you kind of just look at and you realize, oh, maybe we don't align anymore, or maybe, your values are different than mine and I didn't really know that before. And then we just sort of like give up and cut off. And it's been a lot easier to cut people off in the last 3 years than ever before because we weren't out and about. Are you finding that too, that it's just like, and I guess the second question to that is, because I'm going to assume you've been finding that, is that, how bad is that for both people to just like cut that friendship off with no resolution?
Yeah. So again, there's so many different ways we can approach this. So yes, you are correct in assuming that what I sometimes call friendship breakups or friendship dissolutions, that these are certainly common friendship experiences that we all go through. They're not specific to the last few years in the context of the pandemic, but it has contributed in some cases to greater distance, or as you're pointing to, greater ease, right? It's easier to let plans go or let people kind of drift out of our lives. This is actually something that I researched when I was in graduate school, friendship breakups and the different ways that we end our friendships. And it was really interesting to take a look through interviews, actually, qualitative interviews with hundreds of people, asking them about their friendship challenges and how did they navigate those. There are different ways that we end our friendships. I think what you are talking about when you discuss that kind of clean break is almost the experience of ghosting, right?
Yes.
Which
I didn't want to say the word.
Right. Well, and I think it's one of those words that gets thrown out a lot, and sometimes it can lose its meaning. But I do think it's valuable because there is a difference between ending a friendship and having no intention of ever speaking again and not communicating your decision or your reasons for ending that friendship. That can be very painful, actually, for both people. We think often, or it's easier to empathize perhaps with the person who has been ghosted. But we also see that the person doing the ghosting doesn't benefit from that approach either. That there can be a tremendous amount of guilt about what happened. There can be anxiety about, well, what if I see this person again, especially if mutual friends are involved? It does not work out as well as we think it will. And truthfully, it doesn't give us as individuals the opportunity or experience to practice some of those communication skills. And so ghosting can be very painful. It's one of the few ways of ending a friendship that I typically don't recommend, unless, of course, there's a very good reason for it. But there are other ways that we end our friendship. And sometimes that does mean, again, a clean break, but with a discussion. Here's what's happening. Here are the expectations that we have for what our friendship will look like. This is actually what we prefer when it comes to romantic relationships, right? We want that discussion. We want closure and clarity. And for various reasons, again, we don't expect that and we don't do that in our friendships. Very often what happens is this gradual distancing or this gradual growing apart where we are slowly and sometimes not so subtly withdrawing our effort and involvement and attention, not calling as often, not making plans, turning down plans more frequently until we get to a place where the relationship or friendship kind of fizzles out. That, I would say, is the most common way that we end our friendships. And that works. That works well until it doesn't. That works well when both people are understanding and accepting of what's happening.
Okay, so how do we keep our friends close when life is busy? Because it is busy. Life is busy. How do we keep our friends close?
Yeah, I touched on this a little bit before. I do think this is a experience where actually both quantity and quality matter, because we see that, again, that frequency of contact, that consistent involvement is important. And making time for each other on a somewhat regular basis is crucial to feeling connected, staying on top of what's going on in each other's lives, and really just to communicating that this is a relationship that I want to maintain, right? And that can be so challenging. It's easier said than done. Make time for your friends, right? But that is so important. And so it doesn't have to be every day. It doesn't have to be every week even. And I think this is one of the really fascinating pieces about friendship, is that if you ask people what their ideal amount of communication is, or how often they speak to their friends, people will differ in terms of what their expectations are. And I think that's why it's so important to have those conversations with your friends. How often are we talking? Does that feel like it's enough for you? Does that feel like it's sustainable? Is that too much with whatever's going on in your life right now? Having those discussions is so important for making sure that you arrive at some type of a pattern that works for both people. And then, of course, the other side of this is the quality of the connection. How are you spending your time? Can you really focus on communicating your presence, putting away technology, putting away your phone, really making eye contact, figuring out what are the kinds of conversations that we like having, what are our shared values and interests that help us to feel really close to each other? What are the kinds of activities that just help us to kind of embrace that spirit of fun that's so important, and energy in friendships? And again, actually having conversations about that part of it too, and making sure that both people's needs are being met.
Okay, so I mean, it's really fascinating. And I know we could talk about it forever. And I really think that you should write a book.
It's in the works. It is.
I know you're writing a book. And I mean, I don't want to, ask you about times or anything like that. But I mean, this is a big topic. It's, and so it is worthy of a book, right? It's worthy of the expertise of somebody who has studied this and the research behind it. So, I mean, what can you tell us about what you're writing?
Yeah. I think part of how I approach this work is, yes, it's about communicating the research in a way that feels both accessible and relatable, right? Because people, and this was very clear to me in my experience in academia, we're not turning to the journal articles, right? That's not how we get our information, and that's okay. But I do think that there's a place for evidence-based information, especially when it comes to something as important as our mental health and our relationships. And so I always like to lean on the research, but also include like that human personal aspect to it, right? In terms of storytelling, in terms of sharing my own experience. And for me as a psychologist, I also think that bringing in, again, that human piece is so important. It's not just about being told, here's what we can do to make new friends or to strengthen our connections. We really need to be willing to take a closer look at our own experiences, our own internal narratives and thought systems and beliefs that are contributing to certain types of relationships and certain patterns. And so that is one thing that I'm really excited about, is kind of exploring a little bit more of that psychological experience when it comes to friendships, and demystifying some of the beliefs that we have long held that I think actually do us a disservice when it comes to meeting our need for connection.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think through storytelling too, it gives us the opportunity to look or hear from other people who are having the same experiences as us. And then we're like, oh my gosh, okay, so I'm not the only one that, has done this. Or it's really important. It helps. I think it's the only way we can, one of the only ways to grow is to hear other people's stories and understand that we're not alone. Yeah. I can't thank you enough for this conversation. It's been great. You are on Instagram and Twitter at Miriam Kirmayer. And that's Kirmayer, Miriam. So Dr. Miriam Kirmayer, thank you so much for being here. I really, really, really appreciate it. It's been a great conversation.
Thank you. This is so meaningful. And I'm really looking forward to staying connected.
Thanks for listening to another episode of TELUS Talks with Tamara Taggart. Be sure to subscribe so you can join us every Tuesday for another conversation. You can also check out our website, telus.com/podcast, and subscribe to our YouTube channel at TELUS Talks.